All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to the beginning of our developmental psychology class, and we'll talk about some main ideas and concepts that we will kind of continue to come back to as we make our way through the semester. So the first is, what is developmental psychology? So developmental psychology, we study the lifespan from prenatal till death. And developmentalists are researchers and practitioners or clinicians who study the human lifespan. Now, in lifespan development, this is the scientific study of human growth throughout life, as I said, starting prenatally, going all the way through child development, adult development, into old age, and to death. Now, this class, we're going to specifically focus on child development, but you can take a lifespan development course and discuss and learn about these other stages of development. Lifespan development is a field that includes a multidisciplinary approach, meaning it's not just psychologists that study development. We have neuroscientists, nurses, anthropologists, people involved in social policy, certainly physicians, all sorts of different disciplines, and people who study different disciplines all work together to our understanding of development. In terms of development, we focus on predictable developmental milestones. What is the typical time a child learns to walk or talk or goes through puberty? And then again, if we were talking about adulthood or older age, what's the typical time or age that people start to lose their memory? We also have a lot of questions about individual differences. What causes people to be different in terms of different personalities, different levels of IQ? All of these. What causes some children to walk sooner than others or talk sooner than others? So we're often very curious about individual differences. And we explore normative and non-normative life transitions and practices. When we mean a normative transition, that's a typical transition that most people go through. It doesn't mean it's not stressful or difficult. So like the first time a child goes to school, when a child moves out of the house for the first time, all of these normative transitions, again, if we talk about adulthood, retirement as a normative transition. And then non-normative or atypical transitions, these are things that are not typical, but we study how that affects development, such as when a child's parents gets divorced, maybe the death of a parent or a sibling, and if we were going on to study adulthood, perhaps the death of a child, something like that. In terms of setting the context for development, development is influenced by broad ideas, and we're going to talk about these four: cohort, socioeconomic status, culture, and gender. Of course, there are many more aspects of the world, biological as well as environmental, that influence development, but we're going to talk about these four. And we'll start with the idea of cohort. You may or may not have heard this word before, but cohort refers to a group of people born around the same time. And so people born in the same year that you were born, or the same couple of years that you were born, that's your cohort. And a cohort experiences specific environmental influences that may impact their development. They all go through certain things at a certain time in their life that may impact their development in a specific way. So you can think about, these are some 21st century kind of cohort transformations, things that have happened to people who are developing in the early part of the 21st century, compared to maybe people born in, let's say, the 1950s, compared to people born in the year 2000. So from relating in the real world to relating in cyberspace. So what is the impact of all of this online relationships, social media, all of that this can really lead to a very different way in which people relate. And you can imagine, again, if a cohort of people born in 2000 who have always grown up with the internet and all these online relationships, compared to people born in 1950, that's a different cohort, who did not grow up with that, how that impacts development socially in terms of how they relate to people. You can think that this probably impacts brain development in some way, right? So not in a positive or negative way, but just in a different way. From living in an expanding economy to facing financial hardship. Again, in the 1950s, our economy was growing. There was lots of opportunities to make more money. People were doing better than their parents financially. In 2008, we had the Great Recession. And again, it's just not the case now. Things are maybe a little harder. People are perhaps making less money than their parents. It's a different way to think about kind of these standard adult markers and what's the effect of the different economic circumstances on these different cohorts, how they see the world. What about their emotions and mood and feelings of being excited or motivated versus feeling depressed and hopeless? Those are all kinds of questions that would maybe differ between cohorts based on economic factors. And of course, I'm thinking about living through the coronavirus pandemic, right? How is that affecting development at this stage? And depending on where people are in their stage of development, young children who are going through this right now, college age students who are going through this, etc. And so you might think about that, and there will be an assignment about this this week, is to think about how this affects the cohort of people developing during this time. Oops, sorry about that. And even just these changing conceptions of later life. Again, thinking about cohorts, life expectancy now being a lot longer than it was years before. And so people may think about their life in a very different way. Again, if you were born in the year 2000 and have this idea of life expectancy being longer, we now even have new stages that we think about in terms of old age. We have the young old, 60s and 70s, and then the old 80s and beyond. So again, if you were born in 1950 and life expectancy was a little bit shorter, you have maybe different perspectives on how that would impact all sorts of aspects of your lifespan development. What about socioeconomic status? That can have an enormous impact on individuals, and we will talk about socioeconomic status as we go through this class. And the idea of, you can think about it as countries, developed world nations having more wealth, higher life expectancy, technology, access to education and medical care, versus developing world nations that might not have access to clean water, medical care, and education. And you could see how there might be very different differences in development based on the country in which you were born. But then even within a country, certainly within the United States, we have differences in socioeconomic status. And so the idea of wealth and access to education and medical care is certainly not consistent across this country. And so individuals within a country may have different advantages or challenges, and we look at how those socioeconomic influences may alter the course of development. And then the impact of culture and ethnicity. And we will talk about this throughout the class. But culture certainly impacts individuals develop. And this is just one example of if your culture or ethnicity is more of a collective type of culture versus an individual type of culture. And so some people come from more of a collectivist culture in which the good of the group is thought of as more important than perhaps the individual, what the individual wants. And so it's encouraged that individuals conform to society, do what's best for the group, that the group or family rights, the common good, is more important than the rights of individuals, that it's really important to fit in and conform, and working with others and cooperation is normative. The United States is more of an individualistic culture, and we promote individual goals. What do you want? What would make you happy? Those are what we try to kind of think of as the important thing, that each person stands out, they're unique, they express themselves, that you don't need to fit in or conform, etc. And you can imagine that if, depending on in which kind of culture you are developing, that may very much change the path and the developmental process. And so that's just one small aspect of how culture can impact development. And again, throughout the class, we'll talk about the way in which culture may influence development. And then gender. And gender is the impact of gender on development. There is some biology that drives some of our gender differences, right? We know there's differences in biology and hormones and all sorts of things that may drive some biological differences, and environmental factors like what the culture and what society expects based on gender that can also impact development. And so we'll talk about the impact of gender as well. And so we've got here those four topics: cohort, the age group with whom we travel through life; socioeconomic status, right, our education and our income and how that affects development; culture and ethnicity, enduring behaviors, ideas, attitudes shared by a large group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next; and then gender, identifying as either male or female and how that impacts development. We are going to talk about different theories or ways to look at development. We can talk about a perspective, which is a set of assumptions, a view, a paradigm, a way you see the world. And in psychology, we talk about perspective as theories. And these are ways to attempt to explain individual behavior, and allows us to predict behavior and also gives us some ideas on how to intervene to improve behaviors. And as psychologists, what causes certain behaviors is an age-old question, right? You see a child in a grocery store who's having a temper tantrum. We could all look at that child having a temper tantrum and have different ideas or perspectives on why that is happening, right? Someone might walk by and say, oh my goodness, that is such a difficult child, right? It's the child's genes, it's their makeup, they're just a very difficult child. Somebody else may walk by that child and say, oh my gosh, that parent is doing a terrible job parenting. The child's having a temper tantrum, what's wrong with the parent, right? We could go all the way back many, many years where people thought bad behavior was the result of evil spirits inhabiting your body. So maybe that was could be somebody's thoughts. But we all have a different perspective as to what's causing that behavior. So for a minute, you could look at this picture and just think about what you see. Now, some of you may have seen a duck. Here's a duck here with a bill. Right, here's its eye, it's facing towards the left. Some of you may have seen a rabbit. The rabbit's facing towards the right. Here's its little nose, right? The ears are back here kind of facing back. Here's the eye, so the bunny is facing this way, the duck is facing to the left. And we're all looking at the same picture, yet some of us saw a duck, some of us saw a rabbit. That's the idea of perspective. We can all look at the same behavior, the same developmental process, and see something different, right? And so we're going to talk about some of these behavioral theories. And the big question that we'll come back to is the idea of nature versus nurture. Are people shaped by biology? That's the idea of nature. Is it your biology? Is it your genes? Or nurture, right? Is it the environment that causes us to become who we are, that causes people to develop in the way they do? So nature, nurture, nature being the biology and nurture being the environment. So here are some theories, and we're going to keep coming back to these theories as we move through childhood. So we'll start after this chapter in infancy and toddlerhood, and as we move through aspects of development, we'll keep coming back to these different perspectives. So this is an introduction to the perspectives. You may have heard of these before in different psychology classes. But one perspective or theory is the psychoanalytic theory. This focuses on early childhood and unconscious motivations. This was started by Sigmund Freud, kind of the father of psychology. And he really had an analysis of behavior that focused on people's unconscious or their inner thoughts that they may not even be aware of, and that our very early childhood experiences influences our personality and our psychological disorders. The idea here was that mothering, and that's the term then, that it was mothers, particularly during the first 5 years of life, that really determined adult personality and mental health. Boy, that's not a stress for moms, right? Everything in the person's whole adult life, every problem, every stress, every disorder could somehow be linked back to how that child was mothered, and I'm putting that in quotations because this was many years ago, and that's before perhaps the idea of fathers being an important part of parenting, so that mothering during the first 5 years was kind of the key to everything in the person's life. Let's see, unconscious. So this is an important part of the psychoanalytic theory, that a person's personality, basically the part that contains their memories, their knowledge, their beliefs, their feelings, urges, drives of which you are not aware. It's your unconscious, right? And that basically we put psychological material that is disturbing or that is unacceptable into our unconscious. So difficult memories, desires that are not acceptable, sexual desires. Freud talks a lot about sexual desires, fears. We push those down into our unconscious and we're not aware of them. And it becomes kind of a safe haven for threatening events and threatening thoughts and feelings. Freud also talked about 3 components of personality, these hypothetical structures. These are not structures that we have found on any MRI scan, but this was his idea, his theory. Again, remember, we learn about Freud now, particularly because it's very important in a historical context, since he was really the first one to think about psychology and the mind and the brain and how that influences development. So his idea was that we have 3 components of our personality. We have one called the id, and this is the raw, unorganized, inborn part of your personality that has all of your drives, hunger, sex, aggression, irrational impulses, all reside in this part of your personality called the id. We say the id operates on the pleasure principle. Whatever makes the person happy is what the id wants to do. And in fact, you can think about this like an infant. If you've ever been around a little baby, babies are basically all id if we were talking about babies in terms of psychoanalytic perspectives. They want what they want, when they want it, and nothing else matters. If they're hungry, they want to eat. If they're tired, they want to sleep, and they're going to scream and cry until they're able to do that. And that's the idea of the id, that we all have this part of our personality, these inner drives that want to do what we want to do exactly when we want to do them. We want to make ourselves happy. That's the pleasure principle. However, as you get older, past infancy, we develop a part of our personality, again, in the psychoanalytic theory, called the superego. And the superego represents the rights and wrongs of society as handed down by your parents, teachers, other important people. You would call this your conscience. This makes you feel guilty if you do something that's morally wrong. And the third part of our personality would be what's called the ego in Freud's theory. And this is the part of our personality that provides a buffer or kind of a equaling out between the id and the superego. And we say that the ego operates on the reality principle. Its job, the ego's job, is basically to help us control our impulses, our id, and get those drives met, but in a way that keeps us safe and allows us to fit into society and be kind of successful in the society that we live in. So the reality principle and the ego is kind of like this balancing part of our personality that says, yes, you have all these drives, aggression, sexual drives, etc., that you need and you want to have met, but you have to do it in a way that fits into society's goal, morals and standards, and that's the job of the ego. So we could think here about the id, ego, and superego. I'm going to give you some examples, and you think if you can figure out which one of these parts of our personality I'm talking about. Barbara had been dieting for 1 week in an effort to lose 5 pounds before the senior prom. Today, however, a friend offered her a piece of her favorite chocolate cake. Oh, doesn't that look yummy? Although Barbara knew she could not accept it, the temptation was irresistible. She happily accepted it, relishing every bite. Is that the id, the ego, or the superego? Hopefully you're thinking that's the id, right? That's her drives, and she just gave into that part of her personality. How about this one? Robert was at home studying for his physics exam when a friend telephones to say he had 2 extra tickets for the basketball playoff game. 1 ticket was for that evening, the other was for the next evening. The friend invited Robert to join him on both evenings. Although Robert is an avid basketball fan and wanted to go to both games, he told his friend he was studying for an exam and he would not be able to join him tonight. He said he would certainly accept the invitation for tomorrow's game. So what is this? This is the ego, right? We've got to balance what you want to do with what you have to do, right? So he's saying, well, I can't go tonight, but I will go tomorrow, and it's kind of that balancing act of the ego. Joanne, a 15-year-old high school sophomore, had just moved to a new neighborhood and was invited to a party by a group of people who she had recently met. Michael, one of the boys in the group, said, "Hey, Joanne, I just got my driver's license, and my father's lending me his car. Let me pick you up at 8. Although Joanne wanted to accept the offer, she knew her parents would disapprove of her riding in a car with a newly licensed driver whom they didn't know. Regretfully, she said, "No thanks, I already have a ride." So this one would be the superego, right? This is the conscience. This is taking in those rules that her parents told her and maybe not doing what she wants to do, but following the rules. All right. How about behaviorism? This is another theoretical perspective. This is the original nurture theory, that environment is extremely important in development. And this was started by Watson and Skinner. Basically, they started their research with a rat in what they called a Skinner box. There's our Skinner box, which is basically a cage. And they tried to teach a rat to press a lever. And so what happened is every time that lever is pressed, a little food pellet comes out over here. And so initially, the rat would just sort of wander around the cage doing whatever rats do, and maybe accidentally hit this lever. And when he hit the lever, a food pellet comes out. So he eats the food. Goes back to wandering around the cage, and again, maybe accidentally hits that lever, and a food pellet comes out. So now maybe the rat starts thinking, something's going on. When I'm on this part of the cage, I get food. So I'm going to kind of stay over here on this part of the cage, and as he's over here, he accidentally hits the lever, and another food pellet comes out. Eventually, the rat will learn that he just has to keep hitting this food pellet, or this lever, and food will come out, and that's all the rat will do. Will sit here and push the lever. The idea here is that nurture, or the environment, is all important. We can teach a rat to press a lever just by altering the environment, by giving that rat some food. And that the idea with behaviorism is that learning can explain all of our behavior. This is the idea of operant conditioning. This is learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened, or more likely to occur, or weakened, less likely to occur, depending on favorable or unfavorable consequences. This is very much used in parenting, or if you have a younger sibling, or if you babysit or have worked with children, right? If you want a child to do something, you can give them something they want, an M&M, a sticker, something like that, and you're more likely to see that behavior. Let's say every time you clean up your room, you get a sticker, you'll start to see the child clean up their room more. And if there is a negative consequence, something like if you, I don't know, every time you yell at your sibling, you lose the privilege to watch TV, right? There will be less and less yelling at the sibling. And the idea here is that humans, as well as animals, behave a certain way because they are reinforced or rewarded for certain behaviors. And if a behavior is reinforced, it's likely to be repeated. And if a behavior is not reinforced, it's likely to be extinguished. We're not going to talk here about variable reinforcement schedules, but that's the idea. There's also cognitive behaviorism, or what we call social learning theory. This is another extremely important theory in development, and this is that we learn by modeling or imitating others. That we model people who are nurturing or who are involved with us. And that how do we learn? How do children learn? They learn by watching their parents, by watching their siblings, by watching their friends, right? And as a parent, I can tell you, I certainly know this when all of a sudden one of my child says something that I didn't know they knew how to say, but they must have learned that by listening to me or my husband. This is how they learn, or by watching television, right? You learn by watching others. And in fact, there is research to show that we model those who we perceive as being more like us. And you can see that by about age 2, children start to identify with a specific gender, and you start to see these gender-specific behaviors as they model other people who are of their specific gender. But this is, and we'll talk more about this. This is the idea: social learning, learning by watching others. Bandura had an important term called self-efficacy that appears to be very important in development. Self-efficacy is the belief in your own personal competence, that you believe that you can accomplish something. The sense that through your own efforts, you can be successful at a given task. And some people have higher self-efficacy, and some people have lower self-efficacy. What we find is that a strong sense of self-efficacy is an important factor in healthy child development. That if you believe that you can do something, you're more, just in general, you just have this belief that if I work hard, I can be successful. Well, those are people who will set higher goals for themselves, who won't give up, who will work harder, and we see them being more successful in life. Versus people with lower self-efficacy who feel like, I am not very good at accomplishing tasks and I'm probably going to fail anyway. And those people tend to set lower expectations, they give up more easily, and tend to be a little bit less successful. I'm going to skip this example here. This was from some of my own research. I'll come back to that as we move through the class. Another important theory is the idea of attachment by John Bowlby, who shared Freud's psychoanalytic view that early life experiences are important. But the attachment theory particularly focuses on attachment to caregivers, and that shapes our personality. And that our attachment to our caregivers determines whether we will become well-adjusted or emotionally impaired adults. And so the main focus is on an attachment response, and this is how close of an emotional bond does an infant have to their parent or caregiver. Bowlby was an evolutionary psychologist, thought that the attachment response was genetically programmed from our species to promote survival, right? If you think about an infant, they are pretty much unable to care for themselves in any way. And so if an infant does not attach or form a strong emotional bond to a caregiver, then they may be left alone, not fed, and that would lead to a pretty poor outcome for that poor child. And so it is really important for young children to be closely connected to a caregiver, an adult, during early life, and our kind of this idea of an important infant caregiver bond seems to be extremely important from an evolutionary point of view. And then this attachment we see of children who have strong early positive attachments end up being much more well-adjusted as they get older. Like I said, early attachments affects development, and we'll discuss this more in future chapters. Evolutionary psychologists focus on the biological predispositions of individuals, that there are inborn species-specific behaviors that influence development, and this is related to our genes and the idea of survival of the fittest. So this is the idea of nature, that how we develop is based on our nature, based on our genes, our biology, our neurotransmitters, and things like that. And then behavioral genetics focuses on what part of our behavior, what part of our personality is directly related to heredity versus what part is related to the environment. So behavioral geneticists are really trying to figure out what part of our behavior is biology and what part is environment or nurture. And behavioral geneticists, use specific research strategies like twin studies. They study identical twins who share 100% of their genes, and they study fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes. And they look to see what aspects of behavior or personality are more similar with identical twins as compared to fraternal twins, right? If identical twins share 100% of their genes and some aspect of behavior is 100% genetic, well then if one identical twin has that behavior, the other twin will have that same behavior. Now we can see this with physical characteristics. If there are some physical characteristics like hair color that is purely genetic, if one twin has brown hair, the other twin will have brown hair, something like that. And fraternal twins, you would see, because they only share 50% of their genes, you would not see them sharing that same physical characteristic 100% of the time. Now with psychological disorders and different psychological traits, behavior, personality, it's less likely that things are 100% genetic, but nonetheless, identical twins, if something has a strong biological basis, like something like bipolar disorder, we know has a strong biological basis. If one identical twin has bipolar disorder, then there is a much higher likelihood for the other identical twin to also have be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Now, it's not 100%. Bipolar disorder doesn't seem to be 100% genetic, but you see a higher concordance rate. That means that if one twin has it, the other twin has it as well. We can also look at adoption studies where if there's a child who was adopted in infancy into a different family, well, that's another way to tease apart what is biology, what is biological based, and what is environment. So for adoption studies, if you have a child who was born, let's say, to two biological parents who were alcoholics, but that child was adopted away at infancy to a family where there was no alcoholism in the family and substance abuse. Well, if that child developed an alcohol dependency, we would think, that might be more biologically based because the child was born from two parents who had a substance abuse, alcohol abuse diagnosis, and then they were raised in an environment without any substance abuse. And so perhaps that's a more biologically based trait. However, if that child who was born to two parents who were alcoholics was adopted into a family where there was no substance abuse, no alcohol use, and that child did not develop any type of alcohol or substance abuse problems, then we might say, that trait might be more environmentally based because the child was probably born with those genes passed on from their biological parents, but yet they didn't develop that symptom, and so maybe it's the environment that's most important there. So they can do some of this teasing apart. And they're really looking for the idea of heritability, the extent to which any given behavior, whether it be IQ or your sense of humor or how motivated you are in school, or substance abuse, schizophrenia, whatever it is, how much of that behavior is shaped by genetics. And it can range from 1, totally genetic, to 0, no genetic contribution. So the evolutionary psychology, they're looking into nature or inborn biological forces that have evolved to promote survival and to explain how we develop and behave. Behavioral genetics, they have research strategies devoted to examining the genetic contributions that we see between human beings and kind of the effect of genes versus the effect of the environment. So where are we today? The idea is that nature and nurture interact. It used to be really this big either or. Do you believe in nature or do you believe in nurture in terms of development? Do you think it's biology that's the most important, or do you think it's environment? But today we really understand that it's both, that nature interacts with nurture when studying human development, and that we have these evocative forces, which are inborn talents and temperaments that we're born with, that naturally evoke certain responses from others. And then we have active forces. We actively select our environment based on our genetic tendencies. And so then that leads to this idea of a person-environment fit, that it's the extent to which the environment is tailored to the biological tendencies and talents of a particular child. And so our basic goal of developmental science is to foster the correct person-environment fit, that your biology is important, the environment is important, and what's extremely important is that the two fit together, right? The most crucial impact of the nature revolution is to allow intervention to change the environment in order to enhance one's quality of life. Here's kind of the idea that, let's say a child has a very extroverted parent. They grow up in a very extroverted environment where there are people over all the time. They're doing lots of things. Their parents are always going to other people's houses, having people at their house, doing classes with their children, whatever it is, mommy and me, play groups, etc. And if the child is born with an extroverted kind of temperament, well, that's a good fit, right? The child really enjoys being with other people, going out, seeing new things, makes the child very happy. The child loves it. They're very pleasant because they're kind of, that environment really fits with their personality. The parent is rewarded by the child's reaction. The parent feels great. Look at my child. That child is so sweet and happy and laughing, and it's just so great. And so this is a great fit. But if you have this extroverted parent who has an extroverted kind of environment, and the child is a very introverted child, the child doesn't want to be around other people. The child's very quiet, would prefer to read alone, doesn't want to meet new people, is not really interested in these new activities. Well, this is a poor fit, right? Because the parent takes the child to all these new activities. The child might cry, scream, hide, be sad and sulk around. The parent is upset at that child. Why isn't the child enjoying this? Gosh, my child is so difficult. And that can be a really bad fit. And so as developmental psychologists, what we know is that we've got to look at the biology of the child, how they were born, what is their temperament, and that's one place to intervene, particularly early on if there's difficulties, is to look at the environment, and is there a way to change the environment to help the child have a better fit, this person-environment fit. So nature and nurture today, we have our nature or our genetic tendency that shapes our nurture and our life experiences, right? We look for certain things that make us happy, right? Based on our nature. We look for friends, we look for activities that fit our genetic tendencies. But we also need the right nurture, we need the right life experiences to fully express our nature, our genetic tendencies. So this is again in child development. We need the environment that the child is growing up in to allow them to fully express their genetic talents. All right. Theories started, we're going to talk about some different theories, and these we will go through as we move through the different stages of development. But we'll start with some of these age-linked theories. We start with Freud, who discussed psychosexual stages, that as a child develops, they go through these different stages at different ages, you can see here. And we will talk about these throughout the class, that at birth, the oral stage, the anal stage from 1 to 3 years, etc. And certain things Freud said needed to happen at these stages, that children needed to be able to have their needs met in certain ways, like in the oral phase, having to do with eating, being fed appropriately, And once those needs were successfully met, the child could move to the next phase. Okay. Anal phase having to do with toilet training and having that be done in an appropriate way. All right. And we will continue on to explain his theories as we move through this class. But the idea is that personality is based on a series of phases, and that at each phase a child needs to have their needs met to move successfully on to the next phase. And if there was a problem at any one of these phases, you may end up with a difficulty in their personality, right? And we will talk about this, that you would maybe end up with something called a fixation, an oral fixation. You might have heard that term before. When we get into infancy, we'll talk about the oral stage and Freud's theory. But this is the idea that you need to progress through stages. Erikson also was a psychologist who focused on age-linked theories. In this case, he's considered the father of lifespan development. He didn't believe that development ended in adolescence like Freud did. He identified core developmental tasks, or what he called psychosocial tasks, for each of the 8 stages from infancy to old age. And he believed that people needed to master each of the tasks from each previous stage to progress to the next. Again, you don't have to memorize these right now. We'll go through these stages as we move through the class. But infancy, right, the task was this idea of trust versus mistrust, and the child needed to learn to trust in order to successfully move through this stage. To toddlerhood, in which case we're trying to get the child to successfully master some feelings of autonomy, okay? And again, these were age-linked stages that led to successful personality development. You can see that these stages go all the way until late adulthood. And if there was a problem in either one of these, and any one of these stages, again, this could lead to problems in the person's personality development. Piaget, we'll talk about him. Piaget had a cognitive developmental theory. Piaget was really focused on how does thinking develop. So cognitive meaning thinking. How does thinking development? And that at each age, children think in different ways and are able to see the world in different ways. And so he was really the first one to really focus on how do children learn to think. Because you can imagine, right, how a toddler thinks and solves problems is very different from a college student. His theory really started that at every life stage, human beings share a hunger to learn and mentally grow. And he studied children. He even studied his own children. Some of the main ideas, or some terms in Piaget's theory, are schemas. Those are cognitive structures, or your mental representation of something. Assimilation, you add more and more to your schema that makes sense to you. And accommodation, this is changing your schema based on new information. So some examples here of children learning what is a dog. So a young child might start with a schema that something furry with 4 legs is a dog. They may have a dog in their house and they say, oh, that's a dog, it's furry with 4 legs. And the child sees a poodle and says dog. And the parent goes, yep, that's a dog. Sees a husky and says dog, still 4 legs and furry. Great. Sees a chihuahua and says dog. Again, this is all assimilating new information into their schema of what's a dog. But then the child sees a raccoon and says dog, right? That's also has 4 legs and is furry. But a parent says, no, that's a raccoon. And so the child now needs to accommodate or change the schema for dog to understand that some furry animals with 4 legs are dogs and some are raccoons. And so this is the idea of having a schema assimilating information into it, and then accommodating or changing when we learn new information. And we'll talk about Piaget's theory of cognitive development, again, in different stages of thinking. And we will go through that as we go through the semester. And then Bronfenbrenner has this ecological model, was the first to really highlight multi-level, multi-directional forces in human development. And you can see in terms of the development of this child, you can go from the inside to out, that we've got family influences, classroom influences, religious class, peer group influences on the child. Then we can go out to the community, to the school system, to medical institutions, to the media, and then even farther out, economic patterns, social conditions, cultural values. All of these things are influencing the child in a multi-level, multi-directional way. And so the idea here is that we need to use many different approaches to fully understand development, and it emphasizes the need to examine the interaction of these processes, that it doesn't just go from the outside in, that the child also impacts, right, the family, and then the family influences the child, and the family may influence the school system. So it's all interactional. All right, the last thing we'll talk about briefly are some strategies that developmentalists use to measure behavior. So I am a pediatric neuropsychologist, which means I study children, particularly children with different neurological conditions, things like attention deficit disorder or autism. So I've done a lot of developmental research for many years. And there are different ways that we can study development. Naturalistic observation. This is when we observe behavior directly. We often code actions. We look for specific things, and we code like with little check marks. Oh, I see this behavior. I see this behavior. Or a certain behavior is present or absent, and we can do this naturalistic observation in the lab, often in a room through a one-way mirror where we're looking for certain behaviors. Maybe we're looking for certain types of language or certain interactions between a child and a parent. Or in real life, we can go to a school and observe. Again, we would need definitely all sorts of approvals to do something like that, but we could go to a school or a park and observe behaviors in that way. Self-reports, these are questionnaires in which people report their feelings, interests, attitudes, thoughts. And so these are, I'm sure you've filled out many questionnaires in your life, and we have them for child development. So we have a child behavior checklist, and the child's, there's a whole list of behaviors, and we ask the child to circle which ones they do and how often they do them. We also ask parents to fill out those questionnaires, or a depression questionnaire for a child, or an anxiety questionnaire. We have all sorts of self-reports or questionnaires that children and their parents can fill out. And then observer reports. So self-reports being the questionnaires the child fills out, and then observer reports that another person, like a parent, teacher, or somebody else, also completes a questionnaire about the child. And very often we have, as long as the child's old enough to do their own self-report, we often have the child and then a parent report. Sometimes a child, a parent, and a teacher report. Sometimes both parents, right? The child fills out the questionnaire, the mom, dad, and teacher. And so we're looking for differences, which are often very common, or similarities in the way that different observers rate the child on different behaviors. And then two standard research techniques, correlational research and experimental research. We'll start with correlational. Correlations examine the relationship between dimensions of development that occur naturally. And that's the key. When you do correlational research, you are looking at things that occur naturally, You're not doing an experiment where you manipulate anything. You are looking at naturally occurring events. So in correlational research, I might be interested in does hours of watching TV lead to lower grades? And so I just might find, 100 students and ask them all how many hours of TV they watch every day, and then ask them what is their GPA. And so in a correlational research study, all I'm doing is looking for an association between these two naturally occurring variables. I'm saying, this is how much TV these people watch a day, this is their GPAs, and I'm looking for a pattern. Perhaps the more television somebody watches, the lower their grades are. The less television somebody watches, the higher their grades are. I'm looking for a pattern in things that happen naturally. This we just talked about, which kind of research design am I? So I'm going to go ahead and skip that. The one thing to remember about correlation is that correlation does not mean causation, right? Because you have not manipulated anything, you have not done your own experiment. All you're doing is recording things that naturally happen. And because of that, you cannot say that one thing causes another thing to happen. And you can see this, right? The more firemen that are sent to a fire, the more damage is done. This is a correlational study. We could look at a city's fire reports and say, okay, what we find in this fire, how many firemen were sent and how much damage was done. Many firemen were sent to the next fire, how much damage was done. And we see that the more firemen that are sent to a fire, the more damage is done. Now, of course, it makes no sense to say that the more firemen are sent to a fire, that causes more damage to be done, right? That doesn't make any sense. But there's a correlation, and it makes sense because probably the worse the fire is, you get more firemen there, and there's more damage done. Here's another correlational example. Children who get tutored get worse grades than children who don't get tutored. So again, we could ask students in a correlational study, do you get tutoring or not? And what are your grades? Do you get tutoring or not? And what are your grades? And we find that children who get tutored tend to have worse grades. Well, is it the tutoring? Are we going to say that children who get tutored, that causes their grades to go down? No, but children who need tutoring are struggling in school, and so they happen to be getting tutoring, and their grades are probably lower. We can't say that one causes the other. So in order to actually, I'm just going to stop there on these examples. In order to actually say one thing causes another, you need to actually do an experiment. An experiment can determine cause and effect by ruling out other factors that can influence behavior. And to do an experiment, you have a group of participants. You randomly assign participants to different groups, an experimental group and a control group. And then you compare those groups on an outcome variable. So if we went back to the idea of does watching TV, is there a relationship between how much TV someone watches and their grades? We could have a group of participants and we could assign one group, like say 25 people to the experimental group, and we assign them to watch 6 hours of television a day. And then the control group, we assign them to watch no TV and a day for a whole semester. And then we look at their GPA at the end of the semester. If we've done this experiment correctly, and there's a lot more to it than that, but this is the general idea, then if we see that that experimental group has lower grades than the control group who watched no TV, then we could say something like watching TV causes grades to go down. All right, so the key for an experiment is that you are randomly assigning participants to groups, and then you are manipulating something. You're telling one group, you must watch 6 hours of television a day. The control group, you will watch no television. Research designs that are unique to the study of development. We have longitudinal studies and cross-sectional studies, and I'm going to explain them here. Or I'm going to kind of go back and forth. Longitudinal studies observes one group of individuals at different time points. So that's here, a longitudinal study. If we're wanting to look at, I don't know, let's say memory, we can test a group of people at age 20, and then we find those same people again 30 years later at age 50, and then we give them a memory test again, and then we find those same people again at age 80 and give them a memory test. And we look to see what happens with memory between age 20, 50, and 80. So longitudinal is you test one group over many years. Now this is a pretty extreme example, and hopefully this can give you an idea of what could be the problem with a longitudinal study. Well, how long does this particular study to take? It would take 50 years, right? Or am I right? 60 years, because we need to wait for these people who started at age 20 to get to age 60, right? So you would have to I would have to hand down my research to my children and make them finish it. So these studies take a long time. They are expensive, but you can talk about development because you're actually looking at the same people over time. Another type of developmental design is what's called a cross-sectional study. And this is when you observe groups of people of different ages at the same time. So that's here. Right now, I could get a group of 20-year-olds and give them a memory test, and a group of 50-year-olds and a group of 80-year-olds and compare their memory. So this is done at a single point in time, and we can tell the difference between the ages. The problem is because they're different groups of people, you're not 100% sure that it's due to age. This could be due to cohort effects. There could be a reason why 20-year-olds have better memory than 80-year-olds. It could be age. But it could be cohort effects. It could be something like education, right? 80-year-olds, probably many of them didn't go to college. Very few went to graduate school. 20-year-olds, right, they grew up, they're probably mostly in college right now. And so maybe it's just having more education helps your memory. Or maybe it's that darn internet that we were talking about, right? 20-year-olds grew up with the internet, and maybe their brains are working in a way that they're able to hold information better or process information quicker because they're getting information so much quicker than 80-year-olds. And again, it's not age that is the difference, causing the difference in memory, but it might be exposure to the internet or nutrition, right? There are certainly a lot of differences in nutrition in terms of people who are born in who are 20-year-olds now, in terms of lower fat diets, more vitamins, etc. Maybe less, less meat products, where 80-year-olds, right, probably ate a lot of high fat diets. They probably didn't have nutritional supplements or vitamins. And so that could be the reason. But nonetheless, this is a much quicker, more time efficient, less expensive study to do. And sometimes we do both. These longitudinal studies, I've done plenty of longitudinal studies, but we study children maybe over 10 years instead of 60. So it is still hard, it's expensive, it is time consuming, but it is possible. This one is just an extreme example. And then lastly, quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research, this is research that we use where we're gathering data and turning it into numbers that we can then do statistical analyses on. So things like we would measure depression using a depression questionnaire, and we would say this person's score is a 20 and this person's score is a 30. We turn these ideas into numbers, and then we can do statistics. We can compare the means. We can do different tests. I'm not sure if you've taken statistics yet, but things like t-tests and ANOVAs, and we can compare the groups where we take these psychological constructs and we turn them into numbers, right? Does someone have ADHD or not? Well, maybe we're going to say how many times in school they get out of their seat when they're not supposed to. And they turn that into a number, and then we compare those numbers between the experimental group and the control group. There's also qualitative research where we're not interested in numerical comparisons, but we study a single person through observation and interviews. And so qualitative, right? We're not using any numbers. We just discuss what's going on in this person's life. In terms of qualitative research, we might discuss what kind of treatments we're trying, how that's impacting them. It's more like a story, like a very in-depth, detailed story. And so that would be qualitative research. All right, now I know that was a lot of information, but we got through it. And now that we've got through these main concepts, we will talk about each of them as it applies to the different aspects or the different age groups in childhood. Thank you very much.